What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Sand Hill Road, the show where I talk to successful startup founders and their investors about the companies that they built and invest in. And the goal, like always, is to give you a sense of what it's like to be in their shoes, to understand how their businesses tick, how they got to where they are today, and to learn from their many successes and mistakes. And today, I'm super excited to be joined by Mike Ghaffary, who's a general partner at Canvas Ventures.
Being public is like being in the game, right? The shot clock is ticking, everything's happening, all eyes are on you.
At Canvas Ventures, Mike is investing out of their second $300 million fund, focusing on leading the Series A and B investments across marketplaces and consumer software companies. So Mike is a really interesting and resourceful personality with a number of unique experiences as maker, founder, and at-scale operator. From launching the most expensive iPhone app ever, BarMax, which was a $1,000 bar examination preparation app,
I was able to make an app, and that did pay for law school, which was nice afterward.
to co-founding the podcasting app Stitcher before podcasting was even a thing.
We were a little bit ahead of our time. And that shows you why timing is so much of a startup.
To running Eat24 as their CEO during the fiercest times of the delivery wars, Mike has seen it all.
E24, when we acquired it, 30% EBITDA margins. Had never raised a dime of venture capital, which is amazing. Can you imagine? Spitting out cash every year. That was great. The party was beautiful. That's why Grubhub was such an attractive IPO to investors initially.
So in this session, we'll talk to Mike about his journey as builder, operator, angel investor to becoming a VC at Canvas Ventures. And we'll take a deep dive into the marketplace vertical.
Uber started saying, hey, we'll give you a $20 coupon to try our service on the demand side. But what would they give you as a driver on the supply side? We'll give you a $500 credit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That shows you like, okay, which side is more highly valued? Which side do you have to subsidize? Get that on.
But let's hear it from Mike himself, and let's jump right in. Welcome everybody to another session of Sand Hill Road, and I'm super excited to be joined today by my guest, Mike Ghaffary from Canvas Ventures. Welcome, Mike. Ready to take it from the
Hi.
top?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for reaching out.
So before I want to dive into your background as a maker, founder, at-scale operator, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about your early days. And you have really a Swiss Army knife of education. So you started out with a bachelor's in computer sciences. Relatively quickly thereafter, you did the infamous JD MBA combination at Harvard. Then after a one-year stint at a late-stage venture firm, Summit Partners, you decided to go on the founder journey. And you started one of my favorite podcasting apps, Stitcher, before podcasting was even a thing. So you built it really ahead of the market in many ways. Talk to us a little bit about this part of your journey.
Yeah, and it's worth calling out that part of the reason I went to business school really young, kind of right after undergrad, was I had actually started working for an enterprise software company when I was 17 years old. I'm from Cupertino, and it's kind of in the water there. Cupertino was on the map a little bit because of Apple, but the iPhone was still 20 years away from being created. Cupertino wasn't quite as famous as it's now become. Still some Apple orchards left around, still kind of quiet. I started working in software when I was 17 years old, and then did my first startup in college, actually. I had a small college startup that I'm too embarrassed to usually talk about, and it's not on my LinkedIn. But actually, we had some big customers, eBay, PayPal, Symantec. But Stitcher was my first real venture-backed actual startup, to your point, after all the schooling was done, all my kind of part-time during school jobs and internships, other places. It was a pretty incredible journey. Like you said, I started at Summit Partners, and I had always had this itch to start a company again. I'd actually wanted to start a company in business school. Now there's all these amazing companies coming out of Harvard Business School and Stanford and many other schools, obviously. But at that time, there were actually very few. I think you got to realize I started grad school in 2002. Instead of .com boom, everyone was talking about .bust. Whole websites dedicated. There's like the FUC something company that Phil Kaplan had created a website just to show everybody going under. That was kind of the mentality. So I think I was only one of 2 or 3 people, including Jeremy Stoppelman, who then founded Yelp in my business school section, who had any interest in moving back. Like we were coming from Silicon Valley with engineers and wanted to go back. There were like 3 of us. Now, I think it's like half the sections out of 90 people want to go back. But at that time, very, very few. So I'd had that startup itch for a while. But while I was at Summit, I kind of realized, hey, you know what? If I want to be a great investor, I think you really need actually more and great operating experience. So I'm going to take the plunge once again. And my friend Noah Shannock, I had worked with him at BCG. He was on the early founding team at StubHub, not a co-founder, but one of the very first employees. And he had a bunch of different ideas. I was advising him through a few of them. And he told me about the Stitcher idea. And we talked, I said, wow, that's the one. You got to do it like on-demand podcast. This is going to be huge. The iPhone hadn't even come out yet. This was just on iPods. And then the iPhone hit right when we, soon after launching, we thought, this is perfect. This is amazing. This is a game changer. I will say to your earlier question, we were a little bit ahead of our time. And that shows you why timing is so much of a startup. While Stitcher was, I think, an incredible idea, is still an incredible product. Because of market timing, it was admittedly not a huge economic outcome because you got to catch these things right. And sometimes if you're too early, part of it is like network connectivity was still a little slow back then. iPhone penetration wasn't what it is now, iPhone and Android penetration. The content providers, we got them all on board, but they were kind of slow. And just this behavior of podcasting was still a little bit earlier. So on a venture investment timescale, we were kind of early to market, actually.
Remember, you talked about how you got distribution. You were focusing, I think, on news, right? With Stitcher in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So we thought, hey, news and talk radio, there's plenty of music apps. There was Pandora at the time. Spotify kind of launched a little bit later. And there were plenty of options for music. But to us, news was this very valuable segment. If you think as an advertiser, like, would you rather know that somebody listens to kind of the Wall Street Journal and NPR and certain formats, or that they enjoy listening to, the Beatles on the radio? Like, knowing somebody's news habits actually should be more valuable for monetization. And that was part of our thinking, as well as there's a big gap in the market here, and we find it really interesting. And if you could, that was the name, stitch together somebody's news segments to create the perfect kind of news half hour on their commute. And the daily American commute was just going up and up, and it has continued to. We thought that could be a pretty compelling value proposition, and it was. So we'd stitch together, like, you could get your NPR 5-minute kind of summary, then 3 or 4 minutes of the Wall Street Journal Marketplace kind of podcast. Then we started actually creating content partnerships to produce new audio content from blogs. I helped lead a partnership with TechCrunch, where we created TechCrunch headlines, so you can listen to the TechCrunch headlines. I think that was TechCrunch's first podcast ever. So we got a lot of these companies started, VentureBeat and TechCrunch and a bunch of others started on their very first podcast. We were early to market on all of that, and it was pretty successful. We also kind of hoped that news was inherently viral and people would like to share it. But I think it was still early for Twitter and other platforms. So the audio podcast news sharing didn't quite take off the way it has taken off now.
Yeah, I'm super excited about the podcasting space with Spotify doing the 2 large acquisitions with Gimlet and Anchor.
Yeah.
I think it's a super interesting space at the moment, but I can totally see how you were early. And you later became the CEO at Eat24.
Eat24, in my medical opinion, it's the best way to order food online, baby.
And I just learned that you were with Jeremy Stoppelman in the business section at Harvard. And this might have had something to do with it.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about how you got to this position.
So that's right. So Jeremy had actually tried to recruit me once earlier. While we were in business school, I actually ended up writing some of the early Yelp reviews on the site just when he was beta testing the product. He left for the summer, and I was friends with him. So we hung out that summer in San Francisco, summer of 2004 when he was starting it. And then I went back to school. He didn't come back for the second year and said, hey, I'll see how this Yelp thing goes. Apparently it went pretty well. Starting, I think, that first or second summer, I did some early work for Yelp. I helped write one of Yelp's first revenue contracts. With an advertiser. I think it was a pay-per-call contract for a hair salon because I was doing this JD MBA. And Jeremy's like, legal stuff. Can you write a contract? And I was like, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but I could help you just save some legal bills and like put something together that you could, run by maybe. So I did some early work and helped out a little bit. But then Jeremy, I think around the time I was at Summit Partners early on, made me an offer the first time and tried to pull me. And I foolishly thought, you know what? Yelp is too big. It's 20 people now. I want to go co-found my own startup. It might have been smart to go do Yelp, although Stitcher was an amazing experience. But luckily, I got a second bite at the apple. Jeremy recruited me for Yelp later after another startup, TrialPay, that I spent some time with. And then I spent 7 years total at Yelp. But after the first 5 years, there was this little company called Eat24. We first partnered with them when they were under 10 employees and under $1 million in gross transaction volume. And I can give you the background of the transaction platform that we launched for local marketplaces startups, which I think is interesting. But that's how we met them. And then they grew quite a bit. They grew to 150 employees and 150 million in gross transaction volume, with Yelp being their number one source of new users. Having a unique distribution model for E24, their big secret and differentiation was Yelp. That helped catapult that company to be a true competitor to Grubhub and Seamless and the other big players in the industry at the time. After that acquisition, the founder said, hey, Mike, we're not corporate guys at all. They had never worked at a large tech company, a day in their lives. We're really good friends. I've invested in their next startup now, actually. And they said, hey, Mike, why don't you run this thing as a subsidiary of Yelp? We think that's a good idea. And kind of Yelp board and management team agreed. So they said, hey, why don't you be CEO of this E24 subsidiary? And then we grew quite a bit. I ran it for 2 years. We grew from 150 million in gross transaction volume annual run rate to 700 million in those 2 years, and 150 employees to 500 employees. So it's quite a journey and a lot of lessons along the way.
Yeah, and that was really in the midst of what I call the delivery wars.
Oh, yeah, the food delivery wars. We said, look, there were the search engine wars of the late 90s, and I don't know if there's been that intense of a competition around consumer internet since then. Maybe there's the ride-sharing wars, but that's more of a duopoly in the United States. This multi-party kind of competition that only heated up food delivery wars was something that was very top of mind. We talked about, and I told everyone, and I think it's starting to happen, that the tales of these food delivery wars would be written for years to come to motivate employees actually to show up to work and be excited to work in that level of intense competition, because it's actually a lot of fun and becomes business history.
Yeah, and I remember then in 2017 in the summer, I remember the news headline when it was sold to Grubhub. I thought about Yelp being the perfect unique distribution mechanism for this, but it was a fierce market where companies like DoorDash, Postmates were burning cash in the billions.
Give you the whole backstory of like how we thought about that. In 2010, and I think probably got signed in 2011, one of the very first partnerships, I ended up doing 200 partnerships while I was at Yelp and a bunch of, M&A acquisition transactions. One of the very first partnerships I got signed was actually a Grubhub partnership back 10 years ago, but it never launched. And the reason that version of the partnership never launched was we thought the partnership had Grubhub integrating into our app the way E24, Delivery.com, and many others did later. And that's what we thought we had signed. But then Grubhub said, hey, actually, we want you to have the whole transaction happen in the Grubhub app. And we were like, wait a minute, though. It's a lot easier if the person's already got their Yelp credentials saved. They don't have to re-enter everything, go to a new app. Conversion rate will be higher. And we kind of were at an impasse. And it just sat on the shelves, never getting implemented, this partnership. So I joke that we had to go build a whole transaction platform partnership, get multiple partners on, do an acquisition, spend like 5 years building this whole thing up. Finally, for then Grubhub to come say, okay, we'll do that partnership where you can actually just do the transaction to do food delivery right there in the Yelp app, which Grubhub then did. So along with the E24 acquisition was a, part of the give there was like, we will do this and let you acquire it. And we made a big return on it, which was great as well, because we do think it makes sense to be consolidated. But we do want that distribution in the Yelp app. We want those transactions, and Yelp does make revenue on every single food transaction, the same like we did when we owned the company, and then Grubhub kind of gets their share too. That became an interesting platform for us. A mindset we always had at Yelp that we shared with Apple. Steve Jobs and Jeremy had actually spent some time together. I don't know if you remember, but Steve Jobs used to talk about, hey, when you look at the iPhone, people aren't going and like when they need to search a restaurant, going to a browser anymore. They're using the Yelp app. So Steve was a big fan of Yelp.
But on a mobile device, search hasn't happened. Search is not where it's at. People aren't searching on a mobile device like they do on the desktop. What's happening is they're spending all their time in apps. When people want to find a place to go out to dinner, they're not searching. They're going into Yelp.
One of the things for both companies is really focusing on the user first. And if you focus on the user experience as a consumer internet product, and especially for me, like doing BD partnerships and M&A and integrations, if instead of just thinking selfishly like, hey, this is what works for us or them, you've got to look at your own company's self-interest, obviously, but if you also look at like what's best for the user, what's best for the consumer, and then try to fit everything else from there, everything follows quite nicely. And that's how we kind of did our Yelp-Apple partnership. That's how we did the Yelp E24 acquisition. And that was the thinking behind the, let the food delivery transaction, even after we sell it to Grubhub, be integrated in the Yelp app, which I think users really like.
Super interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
So let's transition a little bit into your life as a early stage venture capitalist, and the way that you transitioned was basically by already being an angel investor during your time at Eat24, and you made some angel investments in companies such as Strava, Optimizely, Superhuman, Atrium, Pocket, and my favorite, Phil's Coffee. So some of these rounds must have been really competitive. How did you build these relationships and get on the cap table in some of these angel investments?
Yeah, it's a great question because at the time, there's probably 10 times the number of people angel investing as there were when I started doing it back then. You know, there were some back then, but it's really exploded now. And I think the question for a lot of people is, how do I break in? How do I get these great companies? And I was very fortunate that the first, 10 or so all, had a very high hit rate in terms of working out to be pretty successful companies. And so getting those networks of great people is a big part of it. A way to bootstrap it, because I was also, didn't have a ton of extra cash when I first started doing it. A lot of people think you have to be kind of independently wealthy or something, and I wasn't. I had a lot of graduate student debt from those, 4 years at an East Coast school. It can get very, very expensive. I think I was hundreds of thousands of dollars, like a home mortgage level of grad student debt. After having zero debt from undergrad, being so proud I got a scholarship in undergrad, I piled it all on in grad school just because I had no choice.
But let me jump right in there. I heard you paid it off with the most expensive ever iPhone app launched, Barmax, right?
That did help pay it off. It's cool because I wasn't ever a lawyer except a summer internship at a law firm. So I'm glad I was able to make an app, and that did pay for law school, which was nice. But that was afterwards. Angel investing, the way I bootstrapped my way into the first two was actually advising. And I found if you have a skill as an operator, I started building a reputation, having a unique skill for these BD partnerships. So I talked to the Strava founders and I said, hey, I really love your product. The other thing I'd recommend to people is if you really love a product, whether it's consumer or enterprise SaaS product, try to reach out to the founder and talk to them. If you have some expertise, be great at your day job. And when you're great at your day job, and then you talk to a founder and share your love for their product, they might be interested in how your domain expertise could help them in their company. And that's what happened with Strava first. And the founder of Strava, we hit it off right away. He tried to hire me. He said, hey, can you just come over and do business development here? I said, no, look, I'm not available, but I could advise. I love what you guys are doing. And I'm using the Strava product every day. To this day, I'm using it almost every day to track, runs and bike rides and all the stuff. It's a great product. So we became friends that way. And that led to like, hey, we'll give you an option grant. You can buy some shares. I'm an equity holder, and I got to angel invest in the company. Similar thing with Optimizely, advise them on BD and Corp Dev. That led to me being able to get some investment and equity ownership there. And then, I was able to, when Yelp went public, sell some shares a little bit, diversify my holdings a little bit, and start investing more. And that's how, and I think once you've built some momentum, hey, I've invested in a few companies now, you can kind of broaden it. And that led to some of the others. The other thing is if you put out content, like what you're doing now. So Superhuman, I had written a book on productivity with my friend Charles Hudson because I'm really into Inbox Zero and productivity, and I was giving lots of talks on it. So Rahul, the founder of Superhuman, sought me out. He ended up going to a dinner I was attending, and he said, hey, I've read your stuff, and I think you'd be the perfect investor. And this was his very first round, his kind of first money in. So that's great when people are coming to you. So I think don't sit around and wait for people to come to you. Go reach out to the companies and founders and products you care about, but also put content out there in the world, build your reputation, and you might find people coming to you as well.
Love that. I love that. And so then in 2017, you joined Social Capital. And I remember these days in 2017, Chamath Palihapitiya's great vision of, building this API for founders.
Yeah.
Also doing
capital as a service.
The SPAC, the IPO 2.0. And I was super thrilled about this. And then I remember in 2018, I was at Jason Calacanis' Launch Scale conference. And there he gave this infamous talk about flying too close to the sun. And he was really open and honest.
Thank you for sharing, number one. I think it's really honest. And then you got to this point where you felt like, I'm not happy anymore. And why am I trying to impress these other people?
Why? Because everybody wants to feel validated. And in the absence of being able to validate oneself from within, you will seek others to validate you. And what's dangerous about the world that we live in, which is entrepreneurship and technology, is that it is so in the bullseye of everybody else now. Everybody wants to be in it, around it, on top of it, under it, associated with it, funding it, being a part of it, employed by it, all of it is true. And so it's a very intoxicating, shiny object that people want to have around them. These governments, these pension funds, these family offices, these very famous, important people have all this money. They're like, Chamath, come here, blah, blah, blah. And you start to fall for it. And I fell for it.
Now, what is Social Capital? The partnership's been dropped.
It will be what it always has been. I think, look, when I read articles and you see all the negative press, and it was so weird because I'm about to publish our annual investor letter, and I'll just preview it to you for a second. Our returns are bananas, okay? I've made more in the last 8 years compared to the S&P than Buffett did in the first 8 years of Berkshire.
Talk to us a little bit about your experience joining Social Capital, which went through a lot of changes, and your first investment there, leading the Series A in HubHaus, as well as the Series A in CloudKitchen.
Yeah, Social Capital was an amazing place. Chamath actually just put out the annual letter, the returns and his vision. Chamath really, he is a visionary, and he kind of can see around corners and sees a lot. And so I had a great time there. He describes in these letters, I think the nature of it changed from being a more kind of traditional venture firm, having that arm, to taking on a new structure. So it did make sense, for a lot of us there. We started thinking about like, hey, if we're really committed to doing venture in the more traditional way, we might do that. But it was an amazing time while I was there. The CloudKitchens, one of the first investment you talked about that I kind of sponsored and led the diligence. I had met the founder of that company while I was still at E24, obviously. He was talking to the various food delivery startups saying, hey, I've got this vision for this thing. I don't know if you had the name yet. And I said, hey, this sounds perfect, right? You can reduce delivery times, batch orders, reduce cost, put technology in the kitchens, allow more concepts. Like it just checked all the boxes of the problems and the challenges I had as a food delivery operator in my marketplace, because I was dependent on sometimes fickle restaurant supply in terms of their quality, their ability to use technology, their delivery reliability, and their ability to batch and consolidate orders from one place because they were all over town. And he said he could solve all these things, and the model sounded great. But I didn't know, it's another thing. One thing to have the idea, it's another thing to have the capital, put the idea together, put the team together, execute. So I told him, if you can do all that, that'd be great. And then he did it while I was at Social Capital. He also knew Chamath really well, the founder Diego. The rest is history. And now I think the company's worth $5 billion at the last fundraise and all that. HubHaus, also another amazing company founded by Shruti Merchant, now, well over 10 million top line, helping match people with houses and roommates. You've got the average American getting married like 10 years later than they did a generation or two ago. And we don't have society constructed for what people do during that time. Where do you live? Do you just live alone in a studio apartment? It can be kind of depressing, frankly. So I tell people HubHaus is not only a solution for housing, it's also a solution for like loneliness. Right, you have all those people who are disconnected and all this stuff about social media, and are we too disconnected offline and only connected online? It's nice to have almost a family feel. 5 to 10 roommates will live together in a house. And we've got all this housing stock that was built when people were building bigger and bigger houses. And some of that now people are open to having a more consolidated space, living kind of closer to urban environments or nearby suburbs. HubHaus is doing really well for that. So I got to do some amazing investments, as well as see and work on interesting things like capital as a service and a lot of the new, the SPAC, the other areas we're trying, like being around all that and the colleagues I met. And, the alumni were all kind of friends, keep in touch. So a lot of fun that came from that. But I was really excited when I had the chance to now join the Canvas Ventures team.
There you're investing out of the second fund, the $300 million fund, focusing on leading the Series A and Series B in marketplaces and consumer companies, but also doing, I think you mentioned it somewhere else, like 30% is B2B enterprise. Talk to us a bit about what you're doing and what Canvas is all about.
Yeah, and as a firm, it's probably it's more than that. Enterprise, SaaS, and B2B, definitely more than half. And right now, frankly, like my deal flow and what I've been looking at, my last investment at Canvas, Flyhomes, that I'm really excited about, was consumer facing. But right now, I've been seeing just a lot more activity on B2B and enterprise. Some founders have predicted that a recession might be coming, and now that looks a little more likely. You'll often see during these cycles a shift towards a little more B2B. The other factor that's been well discussed is the platform shift has happened. There was kind of like the PC revolution and a bunch of software for that. Then they all became internet connected, and there was a bunch of software for that. Then there was the mobile revolution and a bunch of software for that. There's not a new platform that really has ubiquity. People were hoping or thinking maybe it's VR, AR, voice. AI. There's been a bunch of candidates, AI people throw out there, but none of these have really taken off. AI does have a lot of potential, but actually a lot of those seem to be B2B applications right now as opposed to consumer applications. So probably right now it's even more than 50% enterprise software and B2B I look at. But let's talk about Flyhomes first. Mm-hmm. Flyhomes is a really exciting company. So they're helping reinvent the residential real estate transaction, a transaction that for many people is the largest transaction they'll ever have in their lives, probably the single biggest and most expensive asset they own. It's a very stressful time, buying and selling these things. And yet even though it's this largest transaction, very little has happened in the past 10 years to make that transaction easier. So you have Redfin and Zillow where you can go shop around. If you need to sell your home in a hurry, there's Open Door, and then Zillow's got in this business too, that kind of iBuyers that'll quickly take it off your hands. And that's one market, especially in homogenous markets, kind of like Arizona. So there's a couple things there. But, for you or me, if you're just saying like, hey, I'm a first-time home buyer, or I want to go upgrade, kind of this trade-up I want to upgrade my house and sell my other house comfortably. It's such a stressful process. It's the biggest transaction, maybe the most stressful financial transaction, or one of the most stressful things you do your whole life is buying and selling these homes. And the founder just thought, first principles, why does it have to be this way? So one of the first products the company offered is the all-cash offer, where they said in these very competitive markets, Seattle, where they started, San Francisco Bay Area, now expanding to places like Boston, LA, DC, you can imagine, really all the top 10 metros for the US, where there's multiple bids happening, for homes, especially in up markets, but even in slower economic cycles in some of these tighter geographies, it still can be very hard to find the right house. So they said, we'll enable anyone to be an all-cash offer. Kind of level the playing field through smart underwriting technology, similar to what like Open Door and some of these other companies have. Now, for the first time, we can build models that can more accurately predict what a home is worth. And so using that, they can also do kind of smarter underwriting and do things that traditional banks can't do to say, hey, we know you can afford this house. We'll line up a mortgage for you. Well, along with the $21 million Series B that we led, and when I joined the board, they announced a $120 million debt line from Citibank. And the funny part is Citi can't underwrite this through their mortgage group, but they can underwrite it working with a tech company like Flyhomes. So they enable anybody, you, me, or anyone who doesn't have to have a rich uncle or be really wealthy themselves, to put all cash, fast close offers on homes, which really helps you win, really appeals to the seller, takes a lot of the stress out of it, might even get you a discount on the house because people might take certainty over a longer close that's uncertain. Then they'll also help you trade up your home, where you can go say, hey, I want to go buy a new home. Give me a guaranteed price on my old home so I know what I can afford, and help bridge that period so you don't have to sell your old home first before buying the new home, which if you've ever tried to sell and buy a home and string those things together, it can be very stressful. They kind of help solve all that. So that's a really exciting company that's grown quite a bit just since we invested.
That's a super interesting segment. Real estate tech segment is one of the hardest, and we've seen a couple of models like you mentioned, the Open Door full stack model, then the data play, Zillow data play. There are so many angles and inefficiencies there.
Well, it's a huge market if you think about just like where dollars go. We spend money as consumers as a housing. So it's this huge chunk of GDP. Transportation was another really big chunk, and Uber, Lyft, they kind of went after that. But the housing one still feels somewhat wide open. So in addition to marketplaces where I've spent a bunch of time across CloudKitchens, HubHaus, E24, various other investments, and real estate tech has really emerged for me because those companies, HubHaus, CloudKitchens, actually all have a real estate angle, and now Flyhomes. And then as a firm, like my partner Paul, previously on the board of House, invested in Roofstock. So kind of as a partnership, we've now got 5 or more companies where we've all done in this prop tech theme. And so we develop more and more expertise and tend to see most of the potential investments there coming through our door now.
Let's take a deep dive into the marketplace vertical now. You have this Medium post titled Where I'm Investing and 15 Marketplace Questions. I want to kick this off with the first question you asked there. Which side of the network values the transaction more? To me, this seems a little bit like a new version of the classical chicken and egg problem of marketplaces.
Yeah, because both are always going to be a problem, right? But which one's more acute? Both at founding and then at this time if it's shifted.
Absolutely.
And what do you think in the long run it's going to be? What do you think the constraint will be in the long run?
And I don't know if you've seen this series of articles put out by Lenny Rachitsky.
Oh, yeah. That's great.
Who was a product manager of growth at Airbnb. And he conducted this series of interviews with all these marketplace early employees and founders. One of his key takeaway was really that what really matters in the beginning is supply. And he has this list where he says Airbnb, OpenTable, Lyft, Caviar, DoorDash, Etsy, they all focus on supply, and only very few, such as Zillow, Rover, and TaskRabbit, focused on demand. Would you say that the standard answer to this first question of yours is that it's the demand side or the supply side?
I would say it's not always the case. I don't know if it's 50-50. In the recent recent wave of consumer apps, then yes, it's been proprietary supply has been the secret. That's been it for Airbnb to get started. That's been it for like Uber, Lyft. That was it for food delivery. And we can talk through those. I agree with that point to an extent. The answer has often been proprietary supply. But if you look at labor marketplaces, it might be different sometimes. It might be actually where you're demand constrained. Sometimes like nurse marketplaces, there's a shortage of nurses. And so proprietary supply, again, is the name of the game. But there's other times where you have plentiful supply and actually getting the demand side locked up. That could be really interesting. That might be part of how it plays out in some of these more like restaurant and some other hourly worker verticals. So it really depends on the circumstance. What I found is a couple of years ago, now more and more it's changing, but a couple of years ago, I'd meet with a founder, and if I asked them this question before I kind of published this article, they often hadn't thought about it. They could like come up with an answer on the fly. And by the way, I didn't invent this question. I got it during business school. I had a professor, Tom Eisenmann, and he didn't even call these businesses marketplaces per se. He called them two-sided networks. Mm-hmm. And he said the first question you ask in a two-sided network, which side of the network values the other side of the network more? Because that's the side you should subsidize. There was an old adage at a nightclub, which side of the network values the other side more if you have like men and women going to a nightclub. And he said, well, you see that there's a lot of these ladies drink free nights and a lot of this effort to make sure that you have kind of a gender balance in the nightclub. If that's the case, what that tells you is the male side of the network is valuing the female side of the network in that example more. Right. And so like that's kind of a silly example, right? It might be dated. And I'm sure there's environments where that could be different. But it's interesting to ask, if you look at the Uber case study, Uber started saying, hey, we'll give you a $20 coupon to try our service on the demand side. But what would they give you as a driver on the supply side? We'll give you a $500 credit. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That shows you like, okay, which side is more highly valued? Which side do you have to subsidize? Get that on. Ed Baker is this guy who is the head of demand side growth at Uber. And we were talking about doing a Yelp Uber partnership. And we said, okay, how much will you pay us per user if Yelp drives users to Uber? And he's like, well, we probably can't pay much, if anything. And I said, why? He's like, we'll pay you if you can get drivers, not consumers. I said, look, aren't you in charge of getting consumers? He's like, yeah, I am. But I'm actually spending all my time trying to figure out how to get drivers. Because when I get drivers, consumers just come. It's so constrained. We just need drivers.
You mentioned that somewhere else that you got like 10 times the number of riders for every driver. And I think you referred to this in number 3 of your question list as the cross-sided network effects, right? And I think you gave us some really interesting examples there with the nightclub, of course, then with the Uber drivers. In the case of Airbnb, I think it's super interesting to look at the pricing, having less of a take rate on the host supply side compared to the traveler side.
Yeah, how you price is really interesting. And Airbnb, another interesting thing about their supplies, they're one of the few companies, like eBay had this going, but not Uber and Lyft, where they have national or even international demand for localized supply. They could go sign up supply in any market, and they can get this like full network effect across their entire database of supply. For Uber, you get supply in San Francisco of drivers, and that only applies to people who are physically in San Francisco. Worse yet, they have to be in the like specific region, little part, square block radii. When you can find a business that has national or international demand for the supply, that actually gets really interesting as well.
I know it from my own experience running a niche home sharing marketplace for techies. Everybody said it's a winner takes it all market, and I personally found that if I get to a certain level of marketplace liquidity in one area, be it Berlin, New York, this already was a lot of value for the network.
Well, it's a good point because you can tap into like all of Europe, right? And maybe the world versus if you're trying to go head to head with Uber, it's much harder because you get some drivers, but convincing those, you have such a small pool of consumers and Uber can be hitting those consumers hard. You don't have the whole world as your oyster to tap into on the demand side.
Yeah, for sure. So let me double click a little bit on unlocking supply in the beginning. And there was this great Medium post by Sarah Tavel from Benchmark where she talked about delivery wars, something that you are intimately familiar with.
I lived in those trenches of the delivery war.
You were
much more
exactly
written and talked about there. Yeah.
You were in the trenches, and she mentioned how Grubhub basically in the beginning, they were focusing on restaurants who had their own delivery fleet. Yeah. And then when the next wave of privately funded DoorDash's, Postmates, and Uber Eats of this world came in, they were unlocking a new supply by looking at restaurants who didn't have their own delivery fleet, and that this was really a source of growth for them, and that this is in many ways the Achilles heel of Grubhub, which was a public company already.
By the way, Eat24 had the same challenge. So getting back to your earlier question, we didn't kind of go into fully. When did we make the decision that it was a good idea to consolidate and sell to Grubhub, do the strategic partnership? We realized, we had this tremendous growth, 150 million to 700 million GMV in 2 years. Eat24 was actually the largest food delivery provider on the West Coast. Seamless had a lock on New York, merged with Grubhub. Grubhub kind of had Chicago and some other parts of the country. And then Eat24 dominated the West Coast. We saw Postmates and DoorDash coming up, and Uber Eats was still experimenting. But we realized pretty quickly there, hey, wait a minute. Since proprietary supply is so important, just getting these restaurants online when they had their own food delivery driver was a big coup. And by the way, Eat24, when we acquired it, 30% EBITDA margins. Had never raised a dime of venture capital, which is amazing. Can you imagine? They got to 150 million of gross transaction volume, and they made roughly at the time anywhere between 10-15% net revenue on their restaurant relationships, all with no outside capital. I mean, it's incredible. 30% EBITDA margins, spitting out cash every year. That was great. The party was beautiful. That's why Grubhub was such an attractive IPO to investors initially. But we could see that the party wasn't going to last forever. A classic kind of disruption coming in. Better proprietary supply, even though it was at much worse margin. This is coming in from DoorDash because now they can enable any restaurant to be on their platform. It doesn't matter whether they have a delivery driver or not. The model is far less profitable. But as a young public company like Grubhub or Yelp, trying to compete, if and trying to potentially tank your profitability to get into this segment is very difficult. Uber was very lucky they weren't a public company yet when they went full steam into Uber Eats. They were able to experiment, scale, build that business, get it kind of predictable enough so that when they went public, they said, yeah, we know we have this big money-losing secondary line of business, but it's growing really fast. It's part of what we do. And if you want to invest in our company, you just need to underwrite this too. And that worked. As an existing public company, especially a young one who's still kind of building out profitability, that's very, very challenging to do. So I would say it was kind of a bit of an Achilles heel. And that's why some consolidation was inevitable. Grubhub had an existential threat. The whole company was just about food delivery. So they kind of had to get into last mile, and they have gone into it. Now, there's a question of how successful that'll be relative to the others, but they've had to do it, and they've had some success and definitely a lot of challenges too. Yelp, for example, didn't need to be doing actual last mile, hiring those drivers and stuff. We could just kind of stay out of it and partner, right, and do the sale to Grubhub. That was kind of our thinking. But it makes for an interesting landscape when that's the interesting thing here is every time you think a marketplace is set and done, your Airbnb example is great. It's like Airbnb, it's locked up. No one will ever have another vacation rental startup again. Someone will. Someone will find new, unique, proprietary supply, a new angle, a different way of doing it. It'll happen with WeWork around office space. Each one of these things gets invented and reinvented and kind of stripped away on the supply side, or it could be a distribution and a demand side angle as well.
I think the really interesting part about these delivery wars is that on the one hand, you actually had this public company, in theory, should have had better access to capital. And then you had, on the other hand, this MPO, Massa public offering, SoftBank-funded DoorDash and Uber Eats, who really had this patient capital to put it all into CAC and negative unit economics.
If you're going to make big business model changes, the public capital markets actually are not a better well of capital. And so I've explained this to a few entrepreneurs. Like, if you have a big pivot, shift, business line expansion, or an Achilles heel, something that you need to open up and do before going public to scale your business, like, try to do that before you go public. Because if you wait until after you're public, that's going to be really challenging. Now, companies sometimes like 10 years into their life of being public will then say, hey, we're going to do a big new direction, we'll change. And often what companies will do in that situation these days, because there's so much private equity, they'll go private. And it's kind of like going on the sidelines. You can imagine a sports team. They'll call a timeout, right? This basketball team, they'll go on the bench, they'll huddle, regroup, redo strategy, figure things out before jumping back in the game. Being public is like being in the game, right? The shot clock is ticking, everything's happening, all eyes are on you. You can't be redoing your strategy, redoing your plays and rethinking everything, redoing the coaching during the heat of the game. You can only do it really on the sidelines in those private markets where, like you said, patient capital will allow you more. Now, that patient capital was extra patient in the peak of the SoftBank era. In the SoftBank is a little bit feels on the retreat era, we'll see if that kind of patient capital in the private markets continues or it takes a break and surfaces later. So that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, it will be super interesting to watch. So a last point I want to focus on is the take rate. The take rate is always a big topic in marketplaces, and it can range from at the lower end from 5%, where it's more like a credit card processing fee, to 25% on the high end, where it feels already like a greedy rate. And there are a lot of different models on how to price it. And I'm particularly fascinated by the Airbnb pricing. When I was acquiring supply for my marketplace, all the hosts told me, well, the take rate is just 3%, because that's basically the story that they were telling the hosts. And on the other hand, you have the 12 to 15% guest rate. Even Jean Tirole, the Nobel Prize winning economist, has a paper on pricing marketplaces. So talk to us a little bit about what you recommend. The typical take rate is in between 10 and 20%. What do you recommend founders?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. First of all, I think you pretty accurately summed it up. Although you put 25% on the high end of the range, I've seen 50 and 65%. I think those are not sustainable. So I'll say that now. But 25 and 30% can be sustainable depending on the value you provide. So DoorDash, for example, if they're providing the last mile delivery, they're really replacing the need to go hire a food delivery person. And overall, when you take all their fees into consideration, adding up to something like 25 to 30 is not crazy, I don't think. Now, if you're just matching and you don't have hard costs like that, and so you don't need to charge that high of a take rate, then you could see it should be maybe more in the 15 to 20%. E24, like I said, they were going between 10 and 15%. Grubhub, back when in the 24 days, I haven't checked it recently, they were at 16%, but trying to creep up towards 20. I think those are all fair. So I think you hit the range well, like 10 to 25. You could be a little higher. If you're out of bounds, here's how I would think about it. Sometimes founders will brag. We have 50% take rate. It's amazing. And I don't think it's anything to brag about, because now your revenue model is hooked on. You're like, hey, we can afford to hire this many employees based on that 50% rate. Eventually, it's going to have to come down. People usually are going to find out. They're not going to be excited about paying that kind of a rate. They're going to try and disintermediate. You leave yourself exposed to another marketplace coming out. If another marketplace comes out and undercuts you by 1 or 2%, that's not going to matter as much, right? It's going to be more about who has the bigger network. But if you're charging 50%, you're just leaving this huge opening. So there is this upper limit, but the lower limit, you made the reference to credit card fees. And that's why I will see a lot of marketplaces charging 1, 2, 3, or 5% is a common one, or like 7. And I say, look, the credit card companies are charging 3 just to swipe the card. 3% just swipe. You built a website, you hired engineers, you have an ops team, a support team, trust and safety maybe. You're matching people together. You're doing all this work that everyone else gets paid 15, 20% for. When you're saying your value you're providing, the toll you can collect, you really think it's only 5%, it tells me one of two things. Either you're massively undercharging, and that's how you're getting people on, and they might complain later when you raise it, or you're not actually providing that much value. And either way, with my investor hat on, when you go talk to investors, they're not going to be thrilled about that. So that's this hack a lot of marketplaces do, or they'll do 0% to get started. That's the other thing I caution founders is they'll say, oh, I did no take rate, just to bootstrap the two sides. That's fine maybe at your pre-seed and your seed stage when you really are bootstrapping, experimenting. Okay, maybe do that. But if you want to actually experiment to see do you have a real marketplace on your hands, one of the hallmarks of that is you've got to start charging the take rate from very early on. There were times where E24 charged 5 to 7% to some early people to get them on board, but they quickly kind of started working on like move them up, and saying, we're going to kick you off the network if you don't. And by the way, it's way easier to just start people at the higher level coming in the door than have to drag them up. It's almost organizational debt that'll drag you down later. I think it's really important to be thoughtful and to charge high enough from the get-go while not being overly greedy and leaving and exposing yourself to competition.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So Mike, thank you so much for being with us here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. It's great. You're so experienced in marketplaces. Such thoughtful questions to ask. So
maybe a last thing, where can people find out more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the Canvas website, if you go to canvas.vc, we have a team page. There's links to a bunch of my stuff there. And then I also write on Forbes and then on Medium too. So I think both on the Canvas website, it links to my Forbes and Medium articles, and you can just kind of pull those up on Medium and Forbes directly too. And you can finally follow me on Twitter, @NewMike. I publish all my stuff there. So just @NewMike.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you.
Appreciate it, Erasmus. Thank you.